Ooh, that's kind of small. Yikes. That's quite big. Impressive.
Hey everyone, it's Sevi. Welcome to my Yunli guide where we'll be covering Yunli's kit and gameplay, Eidolons, Relic and Litecoin builds, team synergies, tips, and more to help you get the most out of this tiny package. And a quick note that the footage and testing here is from the creator experience server, so there may still be some changes in the final version update, but they should be very minor if ever. With that, let's get started. Yunli is a 5-star physical destruction character whose damage centers around her counter and parry mechanics. She's got a very simple but strong kit, so let's see how it works. Yunli's basic attack is only a single target attack, nothing special, whereas her skill is a blast attack that also heals herself. The skill healing scales on her attack, and it helps her self-sustain, especially when she's going to be taking a lot of enemy hits. From her talent trace, when Yunli gets attacked by an enemy, she regenerates an additional 15 energy and launches a counter blast attack, which also counts as follow-up attack damage. Getting hit is important not only to trigger her counter, but because it's also her primary method of recharging her ultimate, which lets her unleash a much stronger counter attack. Yunli can store up to 240 energy maximum, but only needs 120 energy to cast her ultimate ability. You can see it has 2 levels from the ring around her ult, or the dots, to indicate whether she has 1 or 2 ult casts ready. Upon using it, Yunli enters the parry state and taunts all enemies, which lasts until the end of the next ally's or enemy's turn. This parry is her own unique gameplay gimmick and very important to time properly, since you want the enemies to hit her immediately after casting her ultimate while parry is active. If she successfully quote-unquote parries the enemy, she unleashes an upgraded counter attack called Intuit Cull. This deals higher blast damage versus her regular talent counter, and it deals 6 extra hits to a random enemy. Additionally, Yunli's ult gives her counter attack a huge 100% crit damage buff. Combining those boosts results in a crazy high counter damage. However, if parry expires because no enemy was able to hit her in the turn after she cast her ultimate, then she will unleash a weaker version called Intuit Slash. It won't deal the 6 extra hits, which is a significant damage loss. Basically, successfully timed parries unleash Intuit Cull and ensure you're maximizing her damage. If you miss those parries, you're probably casting her ultimate prematurely when an enemy isn't about to attack her in the next turn or action. Understanding your enemy's attack pattern and paying attention at the turn queue will help you know how to best time her ult. Note as well that if it's currently Yunli's or an ally's turn and you cast her ultimate before the character takes an action, then her own turn does not count towards the parry's countdown. Again, it will end after the next ally or enemy turn. In case you have max or near max energy already, you can do this if you want to avoid overcapping energy. But there is a safety net option for missing those parries, which is from her Ascension Abilities, so let's see what they do. With her Ascension 2 or A2 ability, if you trigger an Intuit Slash because of an unsuccessful parry attempt, it guarantees that the next Intuit Slash will be converted into an Intuit Cull instead. You'll notice the HUD icon light up, which indicates that Yunli only triggered an Intuit Slash and has a guaranteed Intuit Cull for her next Intuit Slash. When she finally triggers that guaranteed cull, the icon deactivates. So this is how she makes up for missed parries, but it might not be noticeable or necessary anymore if you reliably trigger Intuit Culls by just timing her ult correctly. Alternatively, you can also deliberately force a missed counter, maybe if you have a specific strategy against an enemy for energy management purposes or whatever reason you have. Then with her A4 ability, while in the parry state, she gets crowd control debuff resistance and a damage reduction buff by 20%, which is nice for added tankiness and ensuring her parry will not get interrupted. And with her A6 ability, using a counter gives her a 30% attack buff for 1 turn, which can easily have consistent uptime as she will be countering repeatedly anyway. Lastly, with her technique ability, casting it gives you the ward effect for 20 seconds. Whether you or an enemy initiates the battle, Yunli will immediately deal an Intuit Cull attack with increased damage. For minor stat bonus traces, she gets crit rate, attack, and some HP. Prioritize leveling her ultimate as her main damage source, followed by her talent then skill. Her basic attack is not necessary to level up. All in all, once you get used to timing her ultimate's parry counter, her gameplay loop is very straightforward. And despite her small stature, her big-ass sword slaps really hard. You can think of her as very similar to Clara, with a unique parry gimmick and stronger potential. Her ultimate counter is the biggest source of her damage, and she'll need to keep recharging to have her ult consistently ready. Thankfully, she has very good energy generation from being attacked. She'll be tanky herself too, thanks to her skill self-heal, plus the extra CC debuff resistance and damage damage reduction buffs. As a follow-up attack counter-focused unit, she can frequently do attack actions outside of her turn, so units that synergize with such a playstyle can also work very well with her as a teammate, but we'll get to that later. Let's now take a look at Yunli's Eidolons. She's already great at E0, and her Eidolons are very straightforward as they're mainly concerned with simply increasing her damage. E1 gives her Intuit attacks a 20% damage bonus buff and gives her Intuit Call 3 more extra hits. If choosing between her E1 and S1, I would first recommend her signature Light Cone more. It has a valuable aggro increase effect, and it generally takes less pulls to get. E2 gives her counters a 20% defense ignore, another damage boost that can get more value when stacked with other defense shred or ignore effects. E3 increases her ultimate and basic attack levels. E4 increases her effect resistance for 1 turn after an Intuit attack for better debuff resistance. E5 increases her skill and talent levels. And finally, E6 makes her Intuit Call attack trigger as long as an enemy uses an ability while she has Parry active, even if that enemy doesn't hit her, so you can be less concerned with enemy attack timing. Her Intuit attacks also get a crit rate and resistance penetration bonus for bigger damage. Now that we understand how Yunli works, let's discuss how to build her, starting with Relic Stats. For the body, you'll want either crit rate or crit damage, depending on what gives her a good ratio. It's good to aim for at least 80% crit rate and 100% or more crit damage bonus. For her boots, you want attack. Her counters and energy generation happen more outside of her actual turns, and the trade-off for more attack to increase her damage per action rather than speed for turns is more worth it. For the sphere, physical damage is generally better than attack, but attack can still be feasible, especially if you have a really good piece, and the gap can also change depending on how much damage percent or attack buffs she gets externally. For the rope, I first recommend attack. For all-around scenarios, though, ERR can have its niche or situational cases, as more energy can result in more parries, albeit with lower damage per action. If you have good pieces for either, you can compare to see what works better in a given scenario. With substats, prioritize crit and attack above all else. Some effect resistance, defense, or HP will help with tankiness. Then when it comes to relic sets, the new Wind-Soaring Valorous is her best-in-slot full set, as it gives useful attack and crit rate bonuses, and the big ult damage bonus is perfect since her ult counter attacks are the majority of her damage output. But here are possible alternatives, with Grand Duke being the next best option. You can choose accordingly based on what you might already have, and if you have the pieces with really good substats. Two-piece combos are always an option and more flexible if you don't have a great full set yet. And for her planar ornaments, her two best all-around options are the Duran and Inert Sal Soto sets. The difference is small enough that it's also a substat game or which world is more efficient for you to farm. For example, if you're farming for Firefly 2, then the simulated universe world of Duran will be more efficient. Sigonia can also be a strong choice specifically for pure fiction, but it's not as effective in many other game modes. And if you just have none of them yet, you can temporarily use less optimal sets until you farm a better set. Now onto her light cones, which will also be straightforward. The free but very good baseline option is the Fall of an Aeon from Herta's store. You can max superimpose it for free, and it generally outperforms all other 4-star gacha options. However, it's also desirable for other destruction units, so if you don't have that many light cone options, sharing it can be a problem. If you happen to have Brighter Than the Sun or the Unreachable Side, these limited 5-star light cones can be better alternatives than Aeon if you can take them from their rightful users. Just note that Brighter Than the Sun requires you to alternate basic attacks in her rotation to maintain the full buff uptime. An S1 Something Irreplaceable is also close to an S5 Aeon, so it's a good alternative if you got it from the standard banner and don't want to take the Aeon from someone else. The 4-star gacha alternatives are less potent than the S5 Aeon, but can be viable at high superimpositions, with Under the Blue Sky being the most recommended one, especially thanks to its valuable crit rate bonus. But if you're pulling for her best-in-slot signature light cone Dance at Sunset, then you're all set. It offers a substantial gain over an S5 Aeon and other gacha light cones, and at least you don't have to worry about sharing Aeon around anymore. It's also the only destruction light cone so far that can greatly increase its user's aggro, which gives it a ton of value for Yunli, especially if you're not using another aggro increasing effect like Lynx, and since outside of her taunt, she has no other innate aggro buffs. That increased chance to get targeted is such a huge benefit to her overall damage and energy generation consistency. It just really makes her performance feel better and more consistent, and as I mentioned earlier, I generally recommend this versus E1 if you're debating between both. Moving on to Yunli's team comps and synergies, she shares a lot of similarities with Clara's team preferences, so if you're familiar with her teams, they're generally applicable here as well. To boost her damage, you want supports that are compatible in buffing her crit attack scaling kit, as well as follow-up attack related buffs. Speed buffs aren't as valuable for her since she's not that reliant on her own turn frequency. Yunli also wants to get hit, so one way to help with that in team building is to place her in the second or third slot, which increases the chances of getting hit by collateral damage, and with certain ally effects that can increase aggro. Be wary of effects that slow or disable the enemy too much, since that will also reduce their attacks on Yunli, which consequently lessens her opportunities to counter and generate energy. Since Yunli will have slow speed, she's not going to consume skill points that fast, and the consequence of using her basic attack rather than her skill isn't that bad, since she's more reliant on counters and enemy hits for energy and damage, so your SP management will be more concerned with her allies. But if her allies aren't as SP heavy too, or have sufficient SP generation, then you likely don't have to worry about much SP management. Yunli's team template can be a hyper carry template where Yunli's the primary damage dealer and other allies are focused on supporting her, or dual DPS teams with Yunli and another main or sub DPS to share the overall damage output and still synergize with each other's playstyles. For limited 5-star harmonies, if you pulled Robin for a follow-up attack focused and or dual DPS team, or Sparkle for a hyper carry buffer, either one of them are easily very strong supports for her. Ruan Mei is a double-edged sword because while she still has very strong damage boosting buffs, her break extension effect will push enemy actions further down the queue, which can mean fewer enemy attacks on Yunli. They can still clear well regardless, but if you also have a break team, then Ruan Mei is likely better there anyway. Tingyun is an amazing 4-star support for her thanks to her strong buffs and very useful energy battery ability that helps with Yunli's ultimate reliability. She's more suited in a hyper carry team due to her single target buffs. Yukong is a notable mention as she has huge attack and crit team-wide buffs whose duration counts down based on your allies' turns. That can work in Yunli's favor, who is slow and deals damage outside of her turn anyway, but you'd have to know how to tune your team's speed and turn order to properly maximize Yukong's buff uptime. It's easiest to do in pure fiction due to enemies spawning in between your unit's turns. And for Nihility supports, Pela is always a great all-around option for AoE defense shredding to help with multi-target damage like Yunli's, and as a good SP generator for your team. But other Nihility units can still work, of course, to various degrees depending on the combat scenario. If ever you have a dual DPS team in mind, some notable DPS allies are the following. The new March 7th Hunt form actually has great synergy with Yunli. March wants her Shifu to use attacks or ultimates to stack her charge points, which allows her to advance and cast her enhanced basic attack more often, and March simultaneously buffs her Shifu's damage, so Yunli's counters and reliance on her ultimate naturally fits that role. The biggest consideration is how March's advance forward might accidentally interrupt Yunli's parry, so you'll have to be mindful of that. For a dual DPS follow-up team, likely with Robin as your harmony support, Topaz and Numbi are a good choice as both a DPS and follow-up attack buffer. She'll strengthen Yunli's counters while Yunli can help advance Numbi's turns with her counters. Just manage Topaz's mark on the best enemies who will receive the increased follow-up damage. And in pure fiction, comping her with one of the staple pure fiction DPSs that is suited to the enemy weakness is generally going to make easy work of pure fiction battles. Yunli's frequent counters work very well with fellow follow-up attack teammate mechanics, such as breaking enemies for Himiko, reducing enemy HP for Herta, or stacking charges for Jade. Then for sustain options, two very notable abundance units are Lynx and Huohuo. Lynx can reliably solo sustain, but more importantly, her skill increases the aggro of destruction units, which, as we've established before, is such a huge benefit for Yunli's playstyle. And this buff becomes even more valuable if you're not using Yunli's signature light cone to give her extra aggro, that I'd highly recommend using Lynx to sustain if that's your case. Meanwhile, Huohuo has her attack buffs and battery utility for higher damage and more frequent ultimate casts on top of her persistent heals and cleanse, which makes her a really good sustain and buffing hybrid support. Luocha also has a special mention since Yunli's frequent follow-ups and counters can also consistently trigger Luocha's healing field, and he's very helpful with cleansing enemy buffs while being a potentially fast SP generator. When it comes to using preservation sustains, you might initially be concerned about how preservation units also also have high aggro themselves, which might conflict with Yunli's aggro. However, there are ways to help reduce this risk. An easy solution is putting Yunli and the preservation unit side by side in the middle slots. If an enemy deals a blast attack, then even if it targets the preservation, Yunli will still take collateral damage to trigger her counter. If you're also using Yunli's signature light cone, that will further skew the chances to her. Avoid using Landau's choice or moment of victory, as those light cones increase aggro for preservation users. Gepard also has his own innate aggro increasing effect, and Preservation MC has their own taunt ability. And while March's preservation form can increase aggro with her shield, it's only single target shielding, which is less comfy, and you wouldn't want to sustain with her ult freeze since that's anti-synergistic with Yunli's playstyle, so avoid them as well. Instead, Aventurine is a very comfy sustain with crit damage buffing utilities, can output decent damage from a sustain, and who can get blind bet points from Yunli's counters. There's also Fushuan, who redirects damage towards her and provides a useful crit rate buff. But of course, these recommendations are not definitive or exhaustive, so feel free to try your own teams and see what others suggest. And lastly, a quick note about Yunli's auto-battle behavior. The main concern is whether or not she can effectively utilize her ultimate parry, and unfortunately, that isn't the case right now. In summary, Yunli will use her ultimate charge as soon as it's ready, and you can imagine how that's not really optimal, as it can lead to many mistimed ultimate casts. There is her Ascension 2 passive to at least help guarantee her next slash will be a call when she misses, but that's of course not as ideal. Other than that, she seems to prioritize using her skill every turn as long as there are skill points. It can still get the job done, but given how reliant Yunli is on her parry mechanic, the process is going to be very inefficient. So in actual challenging content, you just gotta do it yourself. If you're also using her with Lynx, be mindful that Lynx doesn't use her skill unless an ally is at low HP. Even at the start of battle with full or high HP, Yunli will still want to receive the aggro buff from Lynx, which the auto will not initiate or refresh until she's at low health. And that's it for this Yunli guide. Let me know in the comments what you think of this gutsy little swordsmaster so far, and if you'll be pulling for her. If this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!